Well, thanks, Debbie. I think you've set a goal here today so that by the end of our hour here, everyone in the room will kind of understand property taxes and personal property. So kind of understand, that's what we're aiming for. I also like it when I get an audience that applauds before I start talking. I think that shows some faith. Let's see how it goes afterwards. Well, as you see the title there, and the handouts in your packet, is Personal Property Tax Elimination. And I wanted to tell you that you have to be careful about personal property tax elimination. Yes, that's the issue that's on the table. The governor put it on the table about a year ago. But when I started talking about this a little less than a year ago, put together a talk, got a hold of the research that the Legislative Services Agency had done on the impacts of the personal property tax, and started talking about it, and I would say the legislature is considering personal property tax elimination. And I heard from a couple of legislators who said, Professor DeBoer, and when they use the word professor like that, they mean there's a sort of a silent coda at the end of the title. It means, Professor DeBoer, you idiot, we're not considering. You'd think professor would be a really honorific title, but sometimes yes, sometimes no. Professor DeBoer, you idiot, we haven't put personal property tax elimination in any bill considered by the General Assembly in 2014. And that was right. It was never in any legislation. It was never debated. It was never voted on. So let's be clear about that. Now, in what sense, though, did the legislature consider personal property tax elimination? Not formally, certainly, and they're right about that. But on the other hand, the Legislative Services Agency did an exhaustive report on the impact of personal property tax elimination on local governments and on taxpayers, and that came out at the end of December. And LSA doesn't do a report unless somebody asked them to, right? And those somebodies that get to ask LSA to do a report are legislators. So in a sense, I suspect some legislator or other wanted to know what would happen if we eliminated personal property taxes. And the fact that the numbers in that report were so big might have something to do with the fact that the legislation didn't get put in the hopper and that was never debated officially. However, as you probably know, there is a Commission on Business, Personal Property, and Business Taxation that has been meeting this summer and fall. And in fact, their third meeting is tomorrow. And they've been taking testimony, and so the issue is alive. And so I think it's worthwhile thinking about what personal property tax elimination means, why you might want to do it, why you might not want to do it, what the impact would be if you did it. So let's see if we can do that. Let's start out with the property tax base. And I want to start out in particular with Article 10, Section 1 of the Indiana Constitution as it was written in the 1851 Constitution. And there it is. Let me read that for you. The General Assembly shall provide by law for a uniform and equal rate of assessment and taxation, and shall prescribe such regulations. Don't you just love the legal language there? It's almost poetry, it's like the King James Bible. As shall secure a just valuation for taxation of all property, both real and personal, excepting only for municipal, educational, literary, scientific, religious, and charitable purposes, as may be specially exempted by law. That was it. A little bit more than 50 words. We've amended the heck out of this thing. Article 10, Section 1 now has more than 500 words in it. And some of the amendments we've put in there have narrowed the property tax base. You read this thing, everything that could be considered property was taxable by the property tax, and they made sure of it. That's what they meant back then. They meant everything will be taxed by the property tax. Well, about 50 years ago, we decided that maybe there were some things we didn't want to tax with the property tax. And what you have here is a list or a chart of when we eliminated particular kinds of property from the property tax. And the red bars are personal property, types of personal property, and the black bars are real property, buildings and land. Household property was the first to go. Yes, it was actually the case way back when that the assessor would walk down the street, knock on your door, walk through your house, and assess the carpet and the fridge. And when Mom saw the assessor coming, the telephone calls would ripple down the street, right? The assessor is coming. Quick, kids, let's get the radio into the basement, right? And push push the couch off the hole in the rug that we've been hiding on the other 364 days of the year. And it was probably a good thing for the social lives of assessors that we eliminated that, because do you invite the assessor to dinner at your brand new dining room table? I don't think so. So we eliminated household personal property in 1966, and intangibles, stocks and bonds and stuff like that were eliminated then. We eliminated automobiles from the property tax. It used to be that your car was assessed with the property tax. That was a little hard to do because the assessor comes down and you can drive your car somewhere else, all right? And so we said we'll eliminate automobiles. We did that in 1970. Took quite a while after that, but then finally heavy vehicles, trucks, were eliminated in 2000. We phased out inventories from the property tax. And you can remember, I'm sure, the inventory tax sales that used to take place in February in Indiana, and those took place because businesses would sell off their inventories in February. Come the March 1st assessment date, they'd have nothing on the shelves or in the lot, and then they'd build them up again in March and April. We eliminated that, and inventory tax sales are no more in Indiana. What does that leave in our tax base? Well, as far as personal property is concerned, business equipment. Business equipment is almost all of personal property, which is one reason why sometimes people get confused. You say, well, if it's all business equipment, why do we even call it personal property? Why don't we just call it business equipment? We could do that, but personal property has a long history of including other things besides business equipment. Until recently it did. And then buildings and lands, real property, have not really been touched. Of course, there have been certainly exemptions, deductions on real and property, land and buildings, but for the most part, we haven't touched land and buildings in the property tax. Well, here are the amendments. The 1966 amendment was the one that eliminated intangibles and household property, and also eliminated motor vehicles. But notice, and it says this in the Constitution, if you want to eliminate motor vehicles from the property tax, you must institute another tax to take the place of the revenue. And that's where the motor vehicle excise tax came from. The motor vehicle excise tax is a property tax on automobiles, or a substitute for a property tax on automobiles, simply run at statewide rates by the state instead of at local rates by local governments. And sometimes people wonder, you run into a lot of people who think that the motor vehicle excise tax must be used, since it's a tax on automobiles, must be used to build roads. Well, if we used all that money to build roads, we've had some mighty fine roads here in Indiana. In fact, since it was a substitute for the property tax, that's why it gets distributed to all local governments. Just one thing to remember, when we amended the Constitution to eliminate that piece of the tax base, we invented a new tax to replace the revenue. In 2004, we had another constitutional amendment. This one went by so quick, I don't know if people even noticed that it happened, but it did, and we've lost the thing. So follow along on your handout here. It was amended in 2004, and that's the one that allowed the elimination of inventories. And it did a bunch of other things as well, but for our purposes, allowed the elimination of inventories. And that was accomplished by 2007, phased in from 2002 to 2007. And the legislature invented a new tax, the local option income tax, to offset the homeowner tax shift. So if you eliminate inventories, you still collect the same levy, someone else has to pay. Taxes shift from inventory owners to everybody else, and homeowners in particular would end up paying more tax. Well, they gave the counties the option of adopting this new LOIT, local option income tax, to provide a credit for homeowners, and about half the counties adopted that. But again, with this amendment came legislation to invent a new tax to defend other taxpayers from the resulting tax shift of eliminating part of the property tax base. So more revenue, tax shifts, right? New taxes in each of these previous cases. Well, the question I suppose is, do we need an amendment to eliminate personal property from, or business equipment from the tax base? Probably not. The 2004 amendment included this phrase. The Constitution now says the General Assembly may exempt from property taxation any property in any of the following classes, and then there's a whole list, but on the list is tangible personal property other than property being held as an investment, and that's business equipment. So I think the Constitution already allows the exemption of personal property, exemption of business equipment from the tax base, so we probably don't need another amendment to make that happen. Now, this is where I say I'm not an attorney, and there, but for the grace of God, it could have been. But I'm not an attorney. But I can read English, and it is written in English, and so I don't think we need a new amendment on that. Okay, let's now try to establish some facts about personal property taxation in Indiana, in particular how Indiana compares. There's been a lot of talk about how does Indiana's taxation of personal property, how does Indiana's taxation of business, how does Indiana's taxation generally compare to our neighboring states and compare to the other states in the entire United States. I've got two sources on that, and again, you can take a look at your handouts to see both the table and the map on that. Personal property tax for our neighbors. Illinois doesn't tax personal property. They've eliminated personal property taxation in Illinois. Kentucky does, but 8.3% of their assessed value is personal property. Michigan, at the moment, taxes personal property, but they had a referendum back in August, and the people voted 69% to 31% in favor of a series of new bills, new ideas that include phase out of the personal property. So over the next 10 years, personal property will phase out in Michigan. Ohio does not tax personal property except utility equipment, and that's a popular exception, actually, and many of the ideas in Indiana are except utility equipment, right? We want to hit those big plants, because when you think about it, a utility, it's got a little bit of land, and it's got a building structure, but it's that equipment inside the building and all of those wires. That's the stuff that those businesses have to tax. So states often exempt utility when they eliminate personal property. And Wisconsin does have personal property taxation, but only 2.4% of their tax base is personal property. Indiana has it. 13.7% of our tax base is personal property. Take a look at a map, and here we are. Let's move to two more. That one, there it is. There's our map put together by the Tax Foundation, and unfortunately the map is incomplete. When you see those white states there, especially Kentucky and Michigan, which we'd really like to know about, those are blank because they don't have the data for that, unfortunately. So we have to look at the rest of the states. Darker colors mean higher use, higher taxes on personal property. There are a few states, Missouri, Virginia, Mississippi, as you can see, that tax personal property quite a bit. Indiana's kind of in the next tier, but if you circle the Great Lakes region all the way out to New England and all the way out west to the Great Plains, we tax personal property more than most. And so I think we can establish that, in fact, we do use personal property taxes. We do tax business equipment more so than most of our neighboring states, and that the trend is away from taxing personal property. Certainly that is true now in Illinois and Ohio, and most recently in Michigan. Well, we're going to talk here in a minute about the difficulties of doing this, the difficulties for taxpayers, the difficulties for local government revenues. But before I talk about the difficulties, which in a sense are reasons not to do it, why put yourself through these difficulties if there's no reason, let's talk about the reason. And the reasons that people give for eliminating personal property taxes are promoting economic development. And for this, I went into the economics literature, the attempts that economists have made to figure out what impact do taxes have on business location, business investment, business expansion, business employment. What is the impact? And you might think, well, just go out and look, right? Surely we can just look. Well, no, you can't. It turns out there's a reason that economists don't seem to know very much. And that's because it's really hard, okay? And all the really smart people became physicists, right? So, no, but the main reason is that economics is not an experimental science, right? We can't do experiments. We can't say to the governor of one state, for the next 5 years, leave everything else exactly the same, but change personal property taxation and we'll see what the difference is. Of course, no governor can make things stay the same. Think about the property tax caps. What impact do the property tax caps have on economic development? Well, it's a little hard to tell because the very moment that we passed the caps, the Great Recession occurred, right? Did the property tax caps cause the Great Recession? I seriously do not think so. Certainly the people in Ireland, Italy, and Greece don't think so. So how do you separate out? So many things are happening all at once that teasing out the impact of tax differences by comparing different jurisdictions or comparing jurisdictions before and after is a really tough thing to do. And lots of studies come up with lots of different results. So if you want to find a study that says that cutting business taxes enhances economic development, you can find one. And if you want to find a study that says cutting business taxes has no impact whatsoever on economic development, you can find one. And if you want to find one that says, hey, cutting business taxes reduces public services that businesses like and so is a positive detriment to economic development, you can find those too. What we need to do then is to read the entire literature and try to figure out, are there any consensus conclusions that folks have come to? And fortunately, I did find 3 review articles. Those are called lit reviews in the trade, literature reviews, that look at the mass of studies that have been done. Lots of studies have been done. This is always a big issue. And let me talk a little bit about what seems to matter for economic development. And this first list, you notice, doesn't include taxes. Here are the things that most studies conclude matter for economic development. The first one is jargon. It's agglomeration economies. And the idea from that is businesses like to locate near businesses like themselves. Right? And the reason they like to do that is because where there's already businesses like themselves, the expertise is already there, the equipment is already there, the suppliers are already there, sometimes the customers are already there, and sometimes the money is already there, the investors are already there. So this explains Detroit 100 years ago. If you wanted to start an auto company 100 years ago, you locate in Detroit. Why? That's where the parts were. That's where the finance was. That's where the employees who knew how to do that stuff, that's where they all were. So that's where you located. Silicon Valley is the example right now. If you want to start a high-tech firm, you locate in Silicon Valley because that's where the people who know how to do those things are, and that's where the people who want to invest in those things go. And so agglomeration economies count a lot. Now that's a chicken and egg problem, right? How do you get something like Silicon Valley started? And I suspect that's where some of the research would break down, because I suspect what matters there is some individual entrepreneur saying, hey, I'm locating here and I'm going to do this, and it just agglomerates around. But at any rate, agglomeration economies matter. Large and growing population or income matters, especially for businesses that sell locally. So if you've got a big growing metropolitan area, you're going to attract new businesses. Transportation infrastructure matters, especially for those firms that sell nationwide or worldwide. You got to have the railroads, you got to have the highways, you got to have the airport as a way for these folks to ship their products out to the rest of the world. And high-quality employees matter because they're more productive. And if you can get those employees for low pay, so much the better. Right? So high-quality, lower-pay employees are another factor that businesses like. We turn the page here, and we come up with taxes. Right? Let's put it this way. More studies than not. So we haven't got consensus, but we've got majority. Right? More studies than not show that taxes matter for business location. Right? Some don't, but more studies do. And so that means higher taxes tend to discourage business expansion, investment, and location. The effect tends to be small relative to those other 4 things that I just mentioned. So agglomeration economies, labor quality, transportation, that matters more than taxes do. Except, and this is, I think, a very interesting exception, especially considering what's going on in our neighborhood, right, with Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois, except where we're talking about a region, not national, but a region. If you think about, say, Indianapolis and the Donut Counties, the metropolitan area, the agglomeration economies are the same. Right? If you locate in Hamilton County or Johnson County or Marion County, you've got access to what's there. The labor costs and quality are the same. The transportation infrastructure is the same. All those things that matter on the first tier are pretty much the same if you locate within this area. But there are different jurisdictions and different tax districts with different tax rates. So all of a sudden, since all this other stuff is the same and you can locate anywhere within the metropolitan area and still get at that stuff, the taxes matter more. Taxes rise to the top. So on the borders of states, within metropolitan areas, and for some industries, maybe even within a 5-state area, taxes will loom a little larger in their decision making. What taxes? Well, business taxes. Direct business taxes matter more than general taxes. So yes, sales taxes, individual income taxes matter, but the taxes like the corporate income tax directly on business or the tax on business equipment will matter more as far as which taxes matter more and which taxes matter less. Well, that's one side of the budget, and that's fine, but we'd better not forget that taxes have a purpose, and that is to fund local government services. And some local government services themselves encourage business development. And the one that we've already mentioned, the one that was actually right at the top there, is transportation infrastructure. Yes, transportation infrastructure matters. Some of that is private, but an awful lot of it is public. The highway network, in particular, is the responsibility of government, paid for with taxes, and so the money, if you cut taxes and you take it out of your transportation budget, you may be hurting development instead of helping it. So maintaining that transportation infrastructure, particularly highway mileage, does add to development, and more studies than not find that to be true. Public safety spending on police and fire protection adds to development in about half the studies. Half of them find not, half of them find that that acts really matters as well. Public education spending, and this is the family business here, and so you look at these studies and hope, well, in a few studies, public education matters. Now, this is the question. If labor quality matters and labor quality is enhanced by public education, why wouldn't public education show up in the studies as important for business development? Well, it might be that the length of time between improving public education and the ultimate improvement in the labor force might be too long. You might have just now improved your school system, and the kids that are in kindergarten now are going to go through this enhanced public education system and come out as super efficient workers 20 years from now. The workers you got, on the other hand, they were educated the old way. And so it might be a disconnect there between public education and labor quality. But public education has been shown to matter in some studies. So that's what matters. But you'll notice I haven't attached any numbers to these things. And there are regional economic models and what are called input-output models that do attempt to attach numbers to how much extra development you're going to get with a particular change in taxes. But these are iffy, right? And they're hard to check. And they're hard to check in particular because we can change taxes, but lots of other things are going to change at the same time. And so how do we determine which was the tax change, the effect of the tax change, and which was the effect of everything else that went on? So no numbers on this, but a sense as to why you might want to do this. Yes, there actually is evidence that reducing taxes on business equipment could generate more investment, more business location, and more jobs. Well, let's actually get some numbers now and take a look at tax shifts and revenue losses. And to start out, I want you to contemplate this sort of thing, and I suspect this audience dreams these things. All right, I put this in here for the lay audience, and as you can see, it's a simplification of how tax rates are set and how tax bills are set. For the benefit of this audience, let me add that when we talk about the levy, we really mean levies by fund. And we divide that by assessed value. Assessed value, we mean net assessed value after deductions. That gives you the tax rate measured, as we do in Indiana, at dollars per $100 assessed value. You take that tax rate by taxing district, right, the sum of all the tax rates, county, township, city and town, school, library, district, special district, multiply it by the taxpayer's assessed value after deductions, and you get the tax bill, which you then apply the Lloyd credits, the local Lloyd credits to, and then you measure them against the tax caps, which depend on what kind of property we're actually looking at. 1%, 2%, 3%, homesteads, farmland, rental housing, business property, real and personal. So that's how the system works. But the idea, we set the tax rate, and the tax rate depends on the levy and assessed value, which means that if you leave the levy the same, but you mess with the assessed value, you're going to change the tax rate. If you change the tax rate, you're going to change taxpayers' tax bills. If the assessed value we're talking about is personal property, bang, that's zero, and your tax bill's gone to zero. If it's something else, eliminating some assessed value is going to raise that tax rate, and other taxpayers are going to pay more. If that tax bill goes up and pops up above the tax caps, then the local government loses revenue. Right? Then even if you set your levy and expect to collect it, you will find that some of your taxpayers don't have to pay that tax bill. In fact, you'd be shifting taxes from folks who are paying those personal property taxes to a bunch of folks who have to pay only some of those taxes because we've now exceeded their tax caps. So there's a potential here, just by looking at these formulas up here, there's a potential for tax shifting. That is, if we eliminate the taxes on personal property, we shift taxes to other taxpayers through the increase in the tax rate. And there's a possibility of revenue losses, that even if we hold the levy stable at the maximum levy, say, when tax bills go up, more taxpayers qualify for tax cap credits, and the actual revenue collected goes down. Revenue losses, tax shifts, both of these things are going to happen. Well, how much? Well, here's a pie chart from the Legislative Services Agency study. Now, you can still find this on the General Assembly's website, and I recommend it. I put the URL on your handout there under the slide that says Essential Documents. This was December 23rd, and they took the data that was available and ran a simulation. Said, given our tax rates, our levies, our assessed values, what would happen if you yanked personal property out of the assessed value base? What would happen in terms of changing tax rates, changing tax bills, changing tax cap credits? And the answer is this: about 1/3 of the $1 billion in property taxes on personal property, $1 billion, about 1/3 of it shifts to other taxpayers, and about 2/3 of it is lost revenue. Now, most of that lost revenue is through tax cap credit losses, taxpayers being forced up above their caps and not having to pay that property tax that the personal property folks did have to pay. But about 10-15% of it are those few funds that actually have fixed rates. And so when assessed value goes down, the revenue collected goes down. That's a rather small part of our property tax system, but it's in there, as you can see. But moral of the story, $1 billion, 1/3 shifted to other taxpayers, 2/3 lost revenue for local government. That's what they found. Now let me take a look, and I can explain how the tax shifts and tax caps work here by taking a look at this chart, which is the bar chart that shows by property type what would happen to the average tax bill. So the LSA study calculated if we eliminate personal property and we shift taxes, we keep the levy the same, and we shift taxes to everyone else, how much will the taxes of other types of property owners increase? And so one should notice there that the one category I haven't got up there is personal property owners, which would be minus 100%. So not putting that on there kind of biases the result, I suppose. So remember that that's in there, but I didn't put it in there because that would mean you couldn't read the little increases on the bars that you actually see up there. So there's a minus 100% on there that's not shown on the chart. Look in particular at the total there off to the right, 7.1% average increase in tax bills. This is a one-time increase from the elimination of the personal property taxes. It's one-time increase, but then, of course, it's sustained on into the future. And as you can see, there's a variety there. In particular, other residential property, which is mostly small rental property, and commercial apartments see smaller increases in their tax bills, and agriculture sees larger increases in the tax bills. Now, why is that? Both of them are in the 2% tax cap category. Right? Rental housing is other residential, that's in the 2% category, and farmland is in the 2% category as well. But rental housing is mostly in cities or towns. And in cities or towns, you've got that extra layer of tax rate, which means tax rates are higher in cities and towns. The district tax rates are higher in cities and towns than they are in unincorporated areas. Now, this isn't because cities and towns are profligate with their money or just tax raisers. It's because you've got the county rate and the township rate and the school rate and the library rate and the special district rate and the city and town rate if you're in a city and town. And you don't have that if you're outside of the city and town. So rates inside cities or towns are higher. Well, at higher rates, people pay higher tax bills. If you're in the 2% category and the tax rate is above $2 per $100 assessed value, you're going to be at your tax cap. So an awful lot of rental housing, since it's mostly in cities and towns, is at their tax caps. And that means if you eliminate personal property and you attempt to shift taxes to those property owners, they get to say, I'm already at my cap. I don't have to pay. Those who are below their tax caps would see their tax bills increase up to their tax cap. But because so many of them are already at their caps or near their caps, we don't get much of an average increase in tax bills. Now consider farmland. Now, I was actually born in New York City and grew up on Long Island, New York, in New Long Island. And then I saw the light and came out here, right? And I'm glad I did, but I didn't know very much about agriculture, even though DeBoer means the farmer in Dutch, interestingly enough. So it was probably destiny to come out here and work in the College of Agriculture. But nonetheless, I didn't know much about farming. And I've learned a few things. And one of the things I have learned about agriculture by wandering around the halls of the College of Agriculture at Purdue is that most farmland is not in cities and towns. Have you figured that out too, huh? Yeah. Well, what does that mean? If you take a look at your tax rates, most tax rates outside of cities or towns are under $2, right? Which means that the property within, the farmland in those areas is not at their tax caps, which means if you eliminate personal property and raise tax rates, there's a lot of room to raise taxes on farmland before you hit the caps. So farmland sees big increases in taxes if you eliminate personal property. So you can see how the tax caps and the existing tax rates matter for what happens in terms of tax shifts or revenue losses, just by looking at what happens to different property types with the tax shifts. Okay, so what matters? What matters for your county for determining whether you lose revenue, whether you have big tax shifts to your other taxpayers, or, heaven forbid, both? What matters are two things mainly. How much personal property have you got? If you're Brown County, and you haven't got any personal property, eliminating taxation on personal property is not going to have much of an impact. But if you're Gibson County, and somewhere around a third of your tax base, maybe more, is personal property, no matter where you are in any other variable, you're going to get hit. That's going to matter. Right? So along the column there, you see we've got two measures. 14% is kind of the middle average of personal property in assessed value. Less than 14%, more than 14%. Across the top, you've got another measure, and that's how many taxpayers have you got who are already at their tax caps or are close to their tax caps. And I measure that roughly by what's your tax cap credit as percentage of the levy. More than 4%? Less than 4%. At less than 4%, you haven't got many taxpayers already at their caps. More than 4%, you're starting to get a lot of taxpayers already at their tax caps. So that's tax caps as a percentage of the levy. And as you can see, the big number is in the lower right square, 10.4%, which says that if you've got a lot of personal property and a lot of taxpayers at their caps, that's when you get revenue losses, right? Your system is trying to shift taxes, tax payments, away from personal property taxpayers who are paying it to a bunch of folks who don't have to pay, and so you lose that revenue. So this is, again, distributing the counties and taking averages from the 92 counties in those particular circumstances from LSA's study. What about tax shifts? Well, same grid there, 14% greater or smaller for personal property, 4% greater or smaller for tax cap credits as a percentage of the levy. And you can see the big number there for tax shifts is in the lower left corner, 16.5%, which says that the average non-personal property taxpayer, that is, everybody else who will still pay property taxes, basically real property owners living in places where there's a lot of personal property but not very many people at their tax caps would see an average 16.5% increase in their tax bills. Right? And that happens because they're not at their caps, so there's a lot of room for taxes to shift, a lot of room when tax rates go up and personal property is eliminated for people to actually pay those taxes instead of hitting their caps and not paying those taxes. Let's look at the maps and see who's who. And I'll leave these up here for a little while because I know you'll want to study it and pick out your own county. The first time I used this map, as a matter of fact, all of a sudden all the hands went up and they started asking for details about specific counties. So don't do that, all right? But you know who you are, and you know where you can get the numbers, especially. But here it is. This is personal property percent of total tax payments estimated for 2015 from the Legislative Services Agency study. So this is how important is personal property in your tax base. And you know, Purdue gave me this mapping software a couple of years ago, and ever since then I've mapped to just about everything, all right? And you know, it not only had Indiana counties, but they gave me one where you could do states, and then they gave me one that you could do the world, you know, the whole world. So every time I have world data, I'll map out the world. But for Indiana, you know, you do this, and every once in a while you see a pattern that you wouldn't have expected. And the pattern I did not know was out there was Southwest Indiana. Southwest Indiana is more dependent on personal property taxes than most other places in the state. And when I think about that, okay, that makes sense. You've got mostly rural, mostly farmland and rural housing, plus a utility, or a big piece of mining equipment, or an auto factory, right? Those things have lots of personal property, and since there's not that much real property in terms of value in those counties, personal property becomes a large share. So no matter what happens with personal property, if you eliminate personal property, those counties are going to be affected. Other places, as you can see, Howard County is up there. Some rural counties, as well as urban counties, have a good deal of personal property as a share of their tax base, so that their tax rates would be affected if personal property was removed. Well, what about then the increases in real property taxes? These are the tax shifts. What's the average increase of the tax payments by real property owners after you've eliminated the personal property assessed value from the tax base? And as you might expect, Southwest Indiana sees a lot, right? If you eliminate a whole big bunch, a whole big chunk of personal property, you're going to get some big tax shifts. You're going to push lots of people up to the tax caps, but because their taxes are already fairly low, they haven't got that many people at their tax caps, but a whole bunch of them are going to be pushed all the way up to their tax caps. Big tax shifts. Mostly the counties that have the big shifts here are the rural counties, which makes sense. Those are the places where taxes are already fairly low. Those are the places that don't have a whole lot of taxpayers at their caps, lots of room for shifts. You look at Marion County in the middle there, not much in the way of tax shifts. You look at some of the other urban counties there that are at their caps, not much in the way of tax shifts because so many are already at their caps. On the other hand, here are the revenue losses from added tax cap credits. And again, darker colors mean bigger losses, and sure enough, Southwest Indiana is also up there, which means they got so much personal property that they're pushing a whole bunch of taxpayers up to their caps and beyond, which means that they're losing revenue and having big tax shifts. So everybody's going to be unhappy down there as this sort of result, with this sort of result. But here you get the urban counties, right? You got Lake, you got St. Joe, you got Marion as places where the lost revenue will be relatively large. And again, that's because, yes, there's a good deal of personal property in those places, lots of industry, but you've got a lot of taxpayers already at their caps because tax rates tend to be high, which means you cannot shift new taxes to those folks. So that's what matters, and that's who gets affected the most, which counties get affected the most. But again, you can take a look and get a whole lot more detail than this out of Legislative Services Agency's report. You can get it unit by unit and district by district out of that study. Let's take a look at another issue which has a legal name, I've discovered. From the hearing that I went to of the commission, all of a sudden the attorneys began using this Latin phrase. And the Latin phrase was de minimis. And I looked it up. And what de minimis, because I'm not an attorney, as I said, I looked it up, and de minimis means something like the law is not concerned with small things. Right? So, yeah, so if you've got this $1 million lawsuit and the plaintiffs want to argue over this $100 purchase, the judge can say, hey, de minimis, baby. I don't have to be concerned with $100 once we've decided about the million. So what de minimis means here, though, takes account of the fact that a very large number of our personal property tax payers pay very little, have very little personal property, and pay very little. And this is an accounting of the locally assessed property, so the big state utility assessments are not included in here. But this is about 3/4 of all the personal property in Indiana, and it shows that 120,957 taxpayers have less than $5,000 in personal property assessed value. And 27 have more than 100 million. And if you take a look at who pays taxes, those almost 121,000 taxpayers pay in total statewide $5 million. And so it becomes a real question. Does administering that tax cost more than $5 million? And if that's the case, you've got a pretty good case for a de minimis exemption. Oh, I feel so lawyerly here. A de minimis exemption is a possibility here if the law is not concerned with small things. It might be that it's an actual revenue loser to bother these folks to file the forms and then process the forms in the county offices. And even if it isn't a loser, surely $5 million is a very small amount of revenue to collect from all of the effort that is put forth for these 121,000 taxpayers. If you take a look at the top there, you can see that the top 3,500 or so property owners, and again, this doesn't include the big state-assessed utilities, remits $519 million, which is more than 2/3 of the total revenue that's accounted for on this chart, again, with just the locally assessed. So $519 million. So those are the folks who are paying the taxes. Folks in the middle there, as you can see, 50 to $1 million, are paying $198 million. So that's real money. Even $44 million, 5,000 to 50,000, is real money. $5 million statewide, and I can stand here and say, well, $5 million statewide is not real money. But of course, you're dividing it by 92, and that's your assistant in the office, right? So I know that small amounts matter when you actually get down to deciding how many employees you can have or how many miles of road you can pave or that sort of thing. Nonetheless, there is a case to be made that perhaps we can exempt the small taxpayers and not lose very much while saving a whole lot of administrative effort on both the part of the taxpayers and the part of the counties. So that's where that issue comes from. It's just this really skewed distribution as to who actually pays these taxes. Okay, what did the General Assembly do in 2014? Well, they passed Senate Enrolled Act 1, which was Public Law 80, and it did a number of things. Well, one thing it did not do, most certainly did not do, was eliminate personal property taxes. Never even considered, was never even in the bill. But as you know, we have a history in Indiana of when we can't agree on an issue statewide, we make it a local option, right? And we often will say in the bill, the auditor shall. Bills that say the auditor shall means that, well, now the auditor's got yet another administrative duty. And I can imagine, and of course you know whether this is true or not, but I guess I can imagine that that you scan the new legislation looking for auditor shalls. And every time there's an auditor shall, there's another thing you got to do. So at any rate, local options are what we do. Well, we've created a bunch of local options that do the things that the governor suggested statewide. And as far as I know, no county has adopted one of these things yet, but they're out there. And it's not so much of a surprise that counties haven't adopted. This did not bubble up from below. Right? This was top down. And I was frankly a little surprised that that idea of eliminating personal property came up so quick, because we've been through property tax chaos in this state from December 1998 with the Supreme Court decision all the way to the final phase-in of the 2008 reforms in 2011. So that's 13 years of property tax chaos. I had thought, oh, we've got property tax policy fatigue now. We'll wait 5 or 10 years before anybody proposes anything big. No. Well, the politics doesn't work that way, right? You got a new governor with a new program, and here we are. So we've got the thing. But, okay, local options that do the sorts of things that had been suggested statewide. First of all, a local option exemption. A Coit council may exempt any new business personal property. So that basically says counties can, if they want to, exempt the new stuff. Right? So you can keep taxing the old stuff, and as you go, of course, the new stuff replaces the old stuff, so the stuff you are taxing sort of fades away, and the new stuff that you can't tax, you don't get to tax, so your taxation of personal property will gradually taper off. Might be a possibility that creating something like this would create an incentive for businesses to put in new stuff and get rid of old stuff, just to avoid the taxation, and that would be kind of bad for revenues, but kind of good for new investment and construction and that sort of thing. So that would be a mixed bag. Notice also that it's not the county council, it's the Coit council that makes this decision. And I think that's significant. The Coit council, as you may or may not know, was originally invented as a way of deciding whether or not to adopt the county option income tax. And what it is 100 votes, basically, that are distributed among the cities, towns, and the county in a county based on shares in population. So the share that the city has in total population, that's the share of the 100 votes they get. The county represents the unincorporated part of the jurisdiction. And the Coit Council can vote on Coit adoption, and I think there are a couple other things in the law that says they can do. But now they can do this. So what this says is that the county cannot pass the local option exemption if the big city objects. So Allen County, for example, could not pass this thing if Fort Wayne doesn't want it. Right? In my county, Tippecanoe, the county couldn't pass this law unless either West Lafayette or Lafayette would want it. Right? So what it does is shift the power of the decision-making to the bigger cities, or at least in some cases gives them a bigger say in this decision over the counties. And for whatever reason, the legislature decided they wanted the cities to have a bigger say. So when you see Coit Council, it's hey, we want the cities and the towns to have a bigger say over the counties. Exempt small business. Well, here's the de minimis thing. And let me tell you, the Tax Foundation folks were excited by this. When they testified and looked at Indiana's tax system, they kind of liked Indiana's tax system. They said Indiana's property tax system is really pretty good when you look at all of the things that it does, but it lacks a de minimis exemption, except now there's a local option. They were pretty excited about that. So they can do that. The Coit Council can exempt businesses with personal property acquisition cost totaling less than $20,000 from even filing the personal property return. Enhanced abatement. Abatements on new equipment can be 20 years instead of 10 now. And this is the odd thing. This is the legislature in action, right? So the governor proposes a business tax break, personal property taxes. Some of the legislators thought, well, yeah, let's have a business tax break, but you know, it's the corporate tax that really stands out as high in Indiana. Let's reduce the corporate tax. So the personal property bill morphed into an extension of the phasing down of the corporate income tax. We've been phasing it down for a little while now. Now we're going to continue to phase it down all the way out to 2022, down to 4.9%. And then it set up a study commission. And a lot of times, you know, study commissions are kicking the can down the road. You can put out a report. The report gathers dust, and we can say we did something, but we don't have to worry about it. I suspect this one, though, is likely to have some impact, at least in terms of deciding whether we're really going to go ahead with this thing or not. The Commission on Business, Personal Property, and Business Taxation was assigned the task of studying personal property taxes, business versus individual tax shares, effects on local government revenues, reducing business personal property taxes, and other topics. Basically, the entire extent of business taxation, but since it says business versus individual, they could, if they wanted to, study the entire Indiana tax system. And they are focusing on business tax issues, but it's a very broad mandate for this committee. It's chaired by Senator Hirschman, who's one of the heavyweights, right, in the legislature, so that tells me that somebody's taken this pretty seriously. They've met twice already. They've mainly taken testimony from various folks. I did a little bit myself. And then there's the third meeting tomorrow, actually, on October 23rd. What's going to happen with this? I certainly don't know. I gave up predicting what the legislature would do pretty much as soon as I started paying attention to the legislature and trying. So I don't know what this is. Is it the case that Senator Hirschman has in his head something that he would like to do? I don't know. That's just an unknown right now. So we'll have to watch. But we can watch because all of those hearings and all of that material is online. And it makes, if you're interested in the issue, it makes for some pretty interesting reading. There's some pretty good stuff that has been placed on that website, and I'll give you the URL here in a minute. So what's the takeaway? Personal property tax elimination. Lower taxes probably have a small positive effect on economic development, especially within a region, larger effect within a region. Indiana's personal property tax probably is the highest within our region. Public transportation, police, and fire services have a small positive effect on development. So both sides of the budget matter. You can't just cut taxes. You got to worry about delivering services as well. We've got $1 billion in personal property taxes that would shift. 1/3 would go to other taxpayers. 2/3 would be lost revenue for all the local governments. Impact on governments and taxpayers varies a lot by county, and we said why there. It has to do with how much personal property you've got and how close are you to the tax caps. Most personal property tax payments are made by the largest taxpayers, and the smallest 120,000 or so pay very little. And the legislation in 2014 provides for optional reductions in personal property taxes with much smaller revenue and tax impacts that kind of accumulate over many years. You can also take a look at the two essential documents and one essential website. The Indiana Fiscal Policy Institute did a personal property tax report early last year that, if I do say so myself, is an absolute masterpiece of research and explanatory quality. I'm a co-author of that one. We did our best, and it's gotten a good response. So you could look at that if you wanted. This one really, though, Legislative Services Analysis of the Personal Property Tax Elimination from December 2013. You can find it on the Indiana General Assembly website. You go to their property tax area, and you'll find it. And that gives you all of the numbers that you need to look at. And then the Commission on Business, Personal Property, and Business Taxation, which is on the interim committee section of the General Assembly's website. So if you want to follow this issue, you can get your groundwork done with the IFPI report, figure out how it impacts your community with the Legislative Services Agency's report, and then follow along with what's going on by following the commission there. So a three-pronged way to follow this issue. And here's the lit review, and here are the 3 articles that I found that actually take a look at what's the impact of taxes on business development. Well, that's what I have to say. I have not looked at my watch, and I do not see a clock, so I don't know what time it is. If there are questions, I'd be happy to dance around them. Or have I bludgeoned another audience into submission? That happens to me sometimes. Really, any questions that you might have? A question, yes. Oh, a map of the 120,000 businesses. No, I haven't seen that. That's an interesting idea. Something to map. You know, that's a good question. What would you see if you had a map like that? I would guess that most of the big locally assessed taxpayers in urban counties probably, but not entirely, right? Honda, Toyota are in more rural counties. So you'd see something like that. I suspect that the small owners are spread across the state, kind of proportional to population. So I don't know. You could do it, though, as I think about it. The data, I've got the list of 120,000 taxpayers. They're listed by county. I could just aggregate them and map it out. So maybe I'll do that. Thank you. Other questions? Yes? Yes. The 30% floor is the question, and as you know, there is a floor on personal property assessments. If you take a look at the form, the personal property assessment form, the personal property is self-assessed by the taxpayers and the property owners, and so they put down their property and their initial purchase price or the initial cost. They distribute it into pools, you know, a short-lived pool, a long-lived pool. Almost all of it goes into pool 2, which is 8-year life, whether or not that's the life of the thing, that's where it goes. And then they depreciate it, and there's some pretty radical depreciation rates that put those in each category, puts them down to 5, 10, 15% of the original value. But then there's a thing that says, okay, add up the total original cost, and you cannot depreciate yourself down below 30% in total. Yes. It is being talked about. And if you take a look at LSA's report, they have the report on personal property elimination, and then they have the report on elimination of the 30% floor. So you can get the data on that. But at the hearing I was at, in fact, that issue did come up. And when the nationwide tax folks who were reviewing all of the tax laws among all of the states, the one that gave Indiana a very good grade, one of the best grades in the country, said, but the 30% floor doesn't make any sense, they thought. Now, we think it makes sense, or at least the justification for the thing is that if you're a business, even if you've got old equipment, you really ought to be paying something. And that's what we think. But in terms of actual taxation of the value of property as we assess it, 30% floor doesn't make sense. One wonders whether that couldn't become another one of those court cases on property valuation. As far as I know, it hasn't. But yes, I think the 30% floor will definitely come up, and has come up, and probably will come up some more. So an idea of what the impact. Now, you know, I can try to remember what the report said and speculate what it would be. Best thing to do is go read the report and see what it is. But let's think about it for a minute. You'd have to have a bunch of companies that have mostly old property, where the 30% floor would be effective. And if you've only depreciated down to 40 and 50%, you're not at the 30% floor, so it wouldn't matter. So if you're at the 30% floor, so what would happen if you eliminated it? All of that equipment that had, or the sum total of equipment that had been assessed at 30 suddenly drops below. So it's a effect similar to elimination, much smaller, of course, and it would affect kind of the old industrial places more so than the new growing places. So one would expect that a place with a lot of growing retail, Hamilton County, say, might not be affected as much, but a place with a lot of old equipment, Lake County, say. Some of the equipment in those steel mills is, as I understand it, some of those great big urns they've got, it's 100 years old, right? And they're at the 30% floor. Their assessments will disappear on those things. So I would expect that old industrial areas would get hit harder, newer growing areas less hard, but the total impact would be much smaller than full elimination of personal property. Other questions? This is where I need my cricket sound effect that I use in my class, you know. I think we're done. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you.
Thank you.